My patron Muhammad Alabi asked, was the Battle of the Barents Sea as decisive as often claimed? Did it make Hitler scrap his surface fleet?
Well, let's tell the story and see what you think.
In late December 1942, a convoy was sailing from Britain to deliver much-needed supplies to the Soviet Union. This was convoy PQ-19. And this is at a time when Paulus was trapped at Stalingrad, the British had just defeated Rommel at El Alamein, and the Americans had first landed in North Africa alongside the British and others. So we're basically at the midpoint of the war. The Axis were just starting to fall back from their peak in terms of territory captured.
Well, the U-boats had been a menace for a while, so there was some debate regarding whether this convoy should remain as one or be split up into multiple little convoys. And there were advantages and disadvantages to both, but in the end, Admiral Tourvey decided to split the convoy into two.
Thus, Rear Admiral Turler, who was actually retired at this point, sailed with convoy JW51A on the 15th of December, while Commander Rust sailed with JW51B on the 22nd of December 1942. The second convoy was where the action would take place, and it was escorted by the 17th Destroyer Flotilla led by Captain Sherbrooke. Sherbrooke anticipated a surface attack and prepared accordingly, ordering his destroyers to engage the enemy while the minesweeper, the corvettes and the trawlers provided a close escort to the convoy. But during a storm, one of the destroyers, Bulldog, was damaged and had to sail home, leaving just 6 destroyers to protect the convoy. Then, due to getting lost in another storm and the untimely failure of her navigation equipment, the O-class destroyer, the Oribe, was forced to sail south to the Norwegian coast in order to orientate herself before continuing on. Oribe's separation deprived Sherbrooke of its only other ship armed, as was Onslow, with 4.7-inch guns. The remaining O-boats mounted the older vintage 4-inch type. 5 merchant ships and their trawler escort, the Visalma, also became separated from the pack as a result of a gale. Rust and the minesweeper Bramble went off in search of them the next day. 3 were found and returned, but the Visalma and 1 merchant ship were still lost, as was another lone merchant ship, and the Bramble was still out looking for them. Burnett's Force R, which had 2 cruisers and 2 destroyers, were well north of the convoy as a backup force. The idea was that they could remain undetected further away from the coast from U-boats and aircraft, and if the convoy got into trouble, they could move south to assist. Well, U-354, commanded by Herbschlieb, spotted the British ships on the 30th and told Dönitz that a weakly escorted convoy was in the area. The sources differ, with some saying that the Germans didn't know about the British cruisers, while others say Herbschlieb believed a light cruiser was protecting the convoy. But the actual order assumed that there were several destroyers and 1 light cruiser, which was actually incorrect. The British cruisers weren't with the destroyers or this convoy. But anyway, U-354 moved ahead of the convoy and fired 3 torpedoes. But she had been spotted and the convoy dodged the shots. When she tried again, the destroyer Obdurate tried to ram her and forced the U-boat to dive and avoid the depth charges. The German cruiser Lützow, commanded by Captain Stanger, joined up with Captain Hartmann's Hipper, and Vice Admiral Kummetz ordered them to move against the convoy. They had 6 destroyers with them as well, but Kummetz received conflicting orders. On the one hand, he was to only take the Lützow out to the Atlantic, which was his original mission prior to the spotting of the British convoy. On the other, he was to engage the convoy, but not engage it if the enemy had superior firepower, and a little later if they had equal firepower, because the command was scared about needlessly sacrificing their capital ships. And the British might have superior firepower because it was then confirmed that the 2 British cruisers had left port a few days previously. Also, the Germans were concerned about the British destroyers because of their torpedoes, so they had to be careful not to risk the loss of their own heavy ships. In other words, Kummetz was deprived of freedom of action prior to the engagement. No captain of a heavy warship engaged on such a foray as the proposed attack on JW51B would unnecessarily risk losing his vessel. That would be understood, an innate part of his training for command. Yet actually telling Kometz and Stanger with such emphasis that they were not to engage superior forces could have only one effect, to make them overcautious. Nonetheless, Kometz split his force into two and had the Hipper come in from the north, while the Lützow attacked from the south. He was later criticised for these tactics, but they actually worked. The British destroyers were about to be split from the merchant ships as hoped. It was an excellent plan, and, given Sherbrooke's scheme of defence and his power, one that was set fair to succeed. Hitler was informed of the situation and gave the green light for Kometz to engage. The Germans spotted the convoy at 07:18 hours on the 31st of December 1942 and moved in for the kill. At this point, the Zalma and her merchant ship still hadn't joined up with the main convoy, and the Bramble minesweeper was elsewhere looking for another merchant ship. Worse, the cruisers of Burnett's Force R were miles away and wouldn't be able to immediately intervene, so it was looking like the Germans would have the advantage. One of the corvettes spotted two destroyers to the south of them, but because of a previous message about Soviet destroyers coming to meet the convoy, which was a misreading of the signal anyway, the corvette's crew assumed these were the Red Fleet coming to reinforce them, so didn't report the sighting. 10 minutes later, the Obdurate spotted three destroyers and alerted Sherbrooke. Sherbrooke ordered the Obdurate to investigate, and she moved off to take a look. At the same time, Sherbrooke sent his own ship's company to breakfast and ordered them to change into clean clothing. It must have been one of the few occasions when the traditional order before battle was actually given during the last war. As the British ate, the Obdurate followed the three destroyers of the Hipper's group, who then opened fire at 09:30 hours. Slater was about to alert Sherbrooke, but Sherbrooke had already seen the flashes of the guns and ordered the O-class destroyers to line up with him, while the Achates and the other escorts deployed smoke between the enemy and the merchant ships. Sherbrooke also reported to Burnett via radio that they were engaged by the enemy. And at this point, Burnett was actually moving north. His radar had spotted ships north of him, and he misread the situation, believing that the convoy was north, not to his south. In fact, he had spotted the Vizalma and the lone merchant ship with it, not the Germans. But at 09:30 hours, his ships spotted gunfire to the south, so he would now move south, right? Nope. Instead, Burnett hesitated, wondering where the convoy actually was, and believed that this gunfire to the south was Russian aircraft. He therefore didn't move. At 09:39 hours, the Onslow, with the Orwell beside her, spotted the Hipper, which had moved up and opened fire on the Achates. Sherbrooke reacted by engaging the Hipper with his ship and the Orwell for a good half an hour. The threat of torpedoes forced the Hipper to retreat northwards. This surprising reaction persuaded Sherbrooke that Kometz feared his ship's torpedoes, an accurate perception that was skillfully exploited as the two sides skirmished in the semi-darkness to the northwest of the convoy.
But something should be noted here. If Sherbrooke's destroyers fired their torpedoes, which they didn't have many of, then the threat of a torpedo attack would be gone. So the British couldn't actually use their torpedoes because the threat of the torpedo was what gave them their potency. The British ships, all of them armed with 4-inch guns, except the Onslow which had 4.7-inch guns, weren't that effective against German cruisers. They could damage them, but the Graf Spee had received numerous hits, perhaps 70, from 6 and 8-inch guns from the Ajax, Achilles and Exeter, but had been able to sail away before scuttling. So, as Dudley Pope puts it,
a bee dies once it has used its sting. Once their sting, the torpedoes waiting ready in their tubes, was used and missed, then the Hipper would have nothing to fear from them, and they would surely die under the weight of her guns. The merchant convoy had turned southeast as the fighting continued, and uncertain where some of the enemy destroyers were, Sherbrooke split his destroyers into two. His Onslow and the Orwell would stick together, while the Obdurate and Obedient moved back to the convoy. At 09:46 hours, Bernard observed heavy fire to his south that he concluded must have come from his ships, and then received Sherbrooke's report about being engaged. Therefore, at 09:50 hours, he turned about and moved south. At 10:00 hours, Bernard informed Sherbrooke that his ships were approaching from the north. Meanwhile, the Hipper moved in again to engage Sherbrooke's ships, but the German gunners were disorganised and fired poorly. Visibility wasn't ideal, plus the rough seas, but the situation wasn't helped by the fact that corvettes kept firing off a salvo, then sailing out of range before coming back to fire again, switching between different targets. All this put off their aim. However, at 10:20 hours, the Hipper finally got her act together, found the range, and started hitting the Onslow. The bridge was struck, Sherbrooke was wounded, the engine room had holes in it, fires were spreading, 40 men were either killed or wounded, and the radar and half the guns were put out of action. Petty Officer Cook, mortally wounded with both legs blown off, dragged himself along an alleyway complaining that they would only give him bloody aspirins in the sickbay and that he would rather have his daily ration of rum. Burnett could see the gunfire south of him, but couldn't tell who was who, and therefore decided to go east at 10:32 hours, leaving the British destroyers to their fate. The wounded Sherbrooke continued to do his duty, ordering the ship to stay where it was, and took a damage report. Meanwhile, the Hipper shifted its fire to the Orwell, but soon disengaged thanks to a snow squall. Sherbrooke stayed on the bridge until his crew insisted that he get treated for his wounds, and he was later awarded the Victoria Cross for his actions. Kinloch took over command of the flotilla at 10:35 hours. The Hipper, though, had moved east and ran straight into the Bramble. Rust reported that he was being engaged by a German cruiser, but the only ship that picked up his signal was the same corvette from before that had failed to report the sighting of the German destroyers. Well, assuming that this signal from the Bramble had been picked up by the other ships, which it hadn't, the corvette decided not to report this either. Kinloch was only informed several days later. To be fair though, there wasn't really anything that could have been done because by the time help arrived it would have been too late anyway. The Hipper therefore pummeled the Bramble unhindered, with a destroyer called the Friedrich Eckholt finishing it off. All hands were lost. Meanwhile, the British O-class destroyers had regrouped with the Arcatas. And that's when one of the corvettes, can you guess which one? Oh yeah, that one, spotted a large enemy ship coming towards them. And again, it decided not to report this. And this time, the sources don't say why, so it's anyone's guess. Only at 10:45 hours did the other corvette next to it spot and then report that enemy ships were to their south. The large vessel before them was the Lützow, accompanied by her destroyers. It was right next to the merchant ships, but by chance they couldn't engage because of the poor weather and visibility, so moved southeast. Ironically, Kometz's plan had worked perfectly. The Hipper had drawn off the escorts to the north of the convoy had turned south and run, unprotected, into the Lützow, only the Lützow had not fired a shot. That's when the Hipper turned up again and started to engage the Arcatas as it was moving up to join the Onslow ahead of the convoy. The Arcatas was hit, lost her bridge, lost one of her guns, flames were everywhere, she had taken on water, worse, her captain was killed, and Lieutenant Peyton Jones, who was just 24 years old at the time, had to take command of the ship. Jones ignored his orders to rejoin the convoy because he knew he couldn't, so instead deployed smoke as more shots came in. But Kinloch led his 3 destroyers towards the Hipper. The Hipper turned her attention to the Obedient, which then lost her wireless but wasn't seriously damaged, and fearing a British torpedo attack, the Hipper turned northwest, followed by Kinloch for a short time before he turned back. Having lost their wireless, Kinloch wasn't able to command the ships, so Lieutenant Commander Slater of the Obdurate now took over the flotilla. As the Hipper moved away, moments later at 11:31 hours, she came under fire from the north. Burnett had finally entered the battle, and 24 shells came streaming in, then more coming every 20 seconds as the Sheffield and the Jamaica took turns to fire. Shocked by the appearance of the British cruisers, the Hipper was too slow to react and was hit by 4 salvos. She had her guns facing the opposite direction and so couldn't respond in kind, and the damage she took reduced her speed. She was on fire and had to deploy smoke to get away, getting hit twice more as she did so. Taken aback by this action and facing a potentially serious situation of being caught between British cruisers and destroyers, Comet ordered his ships to disengage the enemy and withdraw westwards. This time, the poor weather helped her escape, just as the British cruisers were about to open fire at a close-ish range. Unfortunately for the Germans, 2 of their destroyers, one being the Friedrich Escort, mistook one of the British cruisers for the Hipper and moved up to her. The Sheffield identified the German destroyer from her guns and opened fire on the destroyer at close range with multiple salvos before the Germans could react. The Escort's captain radioed the Hipper saying to stop firing, but the Hipper replied, "No, it's a British cruiser." They were that close that the Sheffield's anti-aircraft guns could shoot at her as well, which they did. The destroyer set alight and sank as the Jamaica fired on the other one. The Beitzen, though, had turned sharply and disappeared under the smoke, so got away. Also in their withdrawal, the Lützow spotted and fired at the merchant ships that were miles away at this point, but only inflicted minor damage on one merchant ship. Then the Hipper appeared, and the British destroyers turned to face it, getting shot at, but the Hipper sulked away at 11:49 hours. Another engagement happened at 12:30 hours, but again nothing happened, and that was the last of the action. At 13:15 hours, Peyton Jones called for assistance as his ship was sinking from its earlier wounds. He ordered his men to abandon ship. Luckily, a trawler came up to rescue the survivors as the ship sank, so many were pulled out of the icy water in time. Of course, many were also not pulled out of the icy water in time. The last evening of 1942 was, for us, memorable, if only for the shock we felt at the loss of so many of our shipmates and our anxiety for the lives of those who seemed unlikely to survive. Hitler waited for news about a German victory, but Comets kept radio silence during the retreat, so Hitler just assumed that the attack had been successful. Then he heard about what happened via the BBC. The British convoy had sailed on and the merchant ships reached their destination unscathed. Hitler therefore raged at Grand Admiral Raeder. "The ships are utterly useless, idly lying about and lacking any desire to get into action. This means the passing of the High Seas Fleet. It is now my irrevocable resolve to remove the guns of the heavy ships for shore defence." Shocked by the threat of having the fleet dismantled, Grand Admiral Raeder resigned to be replaced by Dönitz.
However, despite Hitler's raging and despite some sources saying that it was, the fleet was neither disarmed nor scrapped. Yes, the Hipper never saw action again because it was so badly damaged, and the German Navy was demoralised by what had happened, but there was no scrapping of the fleet. It lost reputation, it lost status, and it was restricted in its operational abilities because this battle showed that the Allies had total above-surface naval superiority, but it wasn't scrapped. So going back to the original question, no, Hitler didn't scrap the fleet. But was the battle as decisive as sometimes claimed? Well, the British lost one old A-class destroyer, the Archates, and one minesweeper, the Bramble, and had another O-class destroyer damaged, the Onslow, although this was quickly repaired. The Germans had lost one destroyer, the Friedrich Escort, and had sustained significant damage to one heavy cruiser, the Admiral Hipper. Enough that she was never made operational again. So, in effect, the total losses for the British were one destroyer and one minesweeper, and the total losses for the Germans were one destroyer and a cruiser. So we could definitely conclude that the Germans came off worse in this battle, and since the merchant ships got to their destination without taking any damage, this has been classed as a British victory. But the losses weren't significant for either side. If the loss of one destroyer and one cruiser was enough to decisively cripple the German fleet, then the issue isn't the losses but the inferiority of the German fleet. So I don't think the losses are that significant or decisive. What is decisive is how the losses were sustained. For most of this battle, 2 German cruisers and 6 destroyers were held off by 5 British destroyers, one of which was an old variant, plus a couple of corvettes and a minesweeper. The British were significantly outnumbered and outgunned. Now yes, it was the 2 British cruisers that did the damage to the German ships, but they didn't turn up until right at the end of the battle. Before they turned up, the Germans should have done a lot more damage to the British ships than they did. They absolutely had the advantage, and they dropped the ball.
That an enemy force of at least 1 pocket battleship, 1 heavy cruiser and 6 destroyers with all the advantages of surprise and concentration should be held off for 4 hours by 5 destroyers and driven from the area by 2 6-inch cruisers is most creditable and satisfactory.
There are several factors which caused the battle to go the way it did. The German naval commanders have been hesitant and unwilling to take risks, and were only willing to engage if they had a decisive advantage. Some have blamed Hitler for this, but this is actually a necessary strategy in the face of naval superiority. The Germans couldn't afford to take losses when the British outnumbered and outgunned them, so they told their admirals to only engage if an opportunity presented itself. The problem is that this resulted in excessive hesitation, and the lesson that the Germans took away from this was that their naval commanders had to be given freedom of action. They had to assess the situation themselves and decide whether to risk a decisive engagement or not. And had this happened at the Barents Sea, it probably would have resulted in more losses for the British. But Admiral Cummets was restricted by his orders from above and received conflicting orders too, so that when he was presented with a golden opportunity to overwhelm a British destroyer force and take out a convoy, he hesitated and then disengaged. The weather also played its part in this, as did the British tactics and the threat of British torpedoes.
Although the intervention of the British cruisers had been timely, it was the constant threat of the British destroyers' torpedoes, which never actually materialised, which had decisively robbed the Germans of the advantage they had possessed.
But I wouldn't say this battle was decisive. It's not a turning point or anything like that, but what it is a shocking victory for the British. This battle should not have turned out the way it did, and for that reason it is an interesting and important battle to study. So if you want to read up on this, the most detailed book I've come across was Dudley Pope's 73 Degrees North. However, if you're interested in hearing about all the Arctic convoys, not just this battle, then I'd recommend the book Arctic Convoys by Woodman. Less detailed on each convoy, but a fantastic introduction to the topic. And for a similar question about how important the Battle of the Atlantic was, check out this video right here. Thanks for watching, bye for now.